On a cold November day in 1847, a small band of Cayuse tribe members launched a violent attack on the Whitman Mission near the settlement of Walla Walla in the Pacific Northwest. This tragic event, which would become known as the Whitman Massacre, left a devastating toll. The victims included Dr. Marcus Whitman, a pioneering missionary who had established the outpost, along with his wife Narcissa and 9 other men. 2 teenage boys were also killed, making for a total of 14 fatalities over the course of several days of bloodshed, with most occurring on the first horrific day. Only 1 man managed to escape the massacre, fleeing to the nearby Fort Walla Walla, though he was believed to have drowned shortly after. Around 50 other survivors were taken hostage for over a month before being ransomed by the influential Hudson's Bay Company. This pivotal moment in the history of the American Northwest would have far-reaching consequences. The Whitman Massacre sparked a retaliatory war against the Cayuse and ultimately led to increased federal control and settlement over the lands that would become the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. In the mid-1830s, a Protestant missionary couple named Marcus and Narcissa Whitman ventured west and established a settlement on land belonging to the Cayuse tribe, along the banks of the Walla Walla River. Initially, the relationship between the Whitmans and their Cayuse hosts was cordial. The Whitmans received assistance from the Cayuse people in cultivating the area, planting and harvesting crops, and erecting the missionary outpost. In turn, the Whitmans supplemented their diet with horse meat provided by the Native Americans until they could grow enough of their own food. The Cayuses even celebrated the birth of the Whitmans' first and only child, Alice Clarissa, in 1837. Narcissa Whitman wrote home describing how the tribal chiefs, principal men, and throngs of women would visit daily to catch a glimpse of the newborn baby. One particular Cayuse headman named Tilukite, whom Narcissa described as a kind, friendly Indian, even welcomed the child as an honorary member of the tribe, since she was born on Cayuse land. Overall, the early years of the Whitman mission seemed marked by a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect between the settlers and their indigenous neighbors. But this fragile harmony would soon give way to a tragic and pivotal event in the history of the American West. Over time, a growing sense of disappointment and disillusionment began to set in between the Whitmans and the Cayuse people. The missionary couple had envisioned the Native Americans eagerly embracing farming, converting to Christianity, and adopting a European-style way of life. However, the Cayuses were only interested in selectively incorporating certain aspects of the newcomers' culture and religion, rather than fully abandoning their own traditional lifeways. These fundamental differences in worldview and expectations fueled increasing tensions and misunderstandings between the two groups. For example, the Whitmans placed a high value on privacy that clashed with the Cayuse standards of community and shared living spaces. Additionally, the Cayuses viewed gift-giving as an essential part of their social and political interactions, which the missionaries perceived as mere extortion. Matters were further complicated when the Cayuses started adopting Western notions of private property rights, demanding payment from the Whitmans for the use of their land and resources. The missionaries took offense at these demands, refusing to acquiesce. What had once been a relatively harmonious relationship was now giving way to deepening tensions and misunderstandings on both sides. The seeds were being sown for an eventual fateful confrontation between the Whitmans and their Cayuse neighbors. The tragic loss of the Whitmans' young daughter, Alice Clarissa, in 1839, dealt a heavy blow to the already fragile relationship between the missionary family and the Cayuse people. The 2-year-old had wandered into the river behind the mission and drowned, sending Narcissa Whitman into a deep depression that she would never fully recover from. The devastating death of their child caused Marcus Whitman to shift his focus away from ministering to the benighted Indians, as he viewed them, and instead concentrate on attracting and supporting white settlers to the region. Whitman became a passionate advocate for American expansion into the Oregon Country, which at the time was not yet an official part of the United States. As described by Reverend Henry K. Perkins, a fellow missionary who knew Whitman well, the doctor wanted to see the country settled, his vision being a bustling, thriving white population filling the beautiful Walla Walla Valley. This shift in priorities and outlook further strained the Whitmans' relationship with their indigenous neighbors, setting the stage for an eventual fateful confrontation. The loss of their young daughter had shaken the Whitmans, causing them to double down on their efforts to transform the region according to their own cultural and religious ideals, even at the expense of the Cayuse people and their traditional way of life. As the 1840s dawned, Dr. Whitman's focus had clearly shifted away from ministering to the local Cayuse people and towards facilitating the influx of white American settlers to the region. The arrival of 3 wagons, the first to be driven along the newly formed Oregon Trail at the Whitman Mission in the fall of 1840 by a group of former mountain men and their families, served as an example of this. 4 years prior, Whitman himself had tried to transport a wagon to Oregon, but had been forced to give it up farther east. Now, greeting this new party of emigrants, he reportedly told the leaders Robert Newell and Joseph Meek, "You have broken the ice. When others notice that the carts have gone by, they will follow suit, and our people will fill the valley in a few years." This prediction quickly came to pass, as the following year saw a group of 24 more settlers from Missouri reach the Whitman Mission. "It's doubtful that each year will bring more and more into this country," wrote Narcissa Whitman in a letter, "for as long as we dwell here, our small cottage will serve as a resting place for many tired, weary travelers." The missionary couple's eagerness to facilitate the arrival and settlement of white Americans in the region, at the expense of their relationship with the native Cayuse people, would ultimately contribute to the tragic events that were to unfold. By the early 1840s, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions was sponsoring 4 separate missionary outposts located hundreds of miles apart across Oregon country. Unfortunately, the missionaries stationed at these various posts were constantly bickering and quarreling amongst themselves. The board ordered the closing of the Wailapu Mission and 2 other stations in 1842, because it was frustrated with the volume of letters from Oregon expressing dissatisfaction and the lack of progress in converting the native populations. They also recalled 2 of the most troublesome missionaries while reassigning Dr. Whitman to the remaining mission near Spokane. When Whitman received this news several months later, he sought the consent of his fellow missionaries to make a dangerous midwinter journey back to Boston. There, he argued passionately that Wailapu was a vital strategic rest stop and supply station for the growing numbers of American settlers traveling the Oregon Trail. Whitman warned that if the Protestants abandoned the mission, it would be taken over by Catholic papists. Persuaded by Whitman's arguments, the board reluctantly rescinded their closure order. When Whitman arrived to Oregon in the fall of 1843, he was leading a wagon train that was transporting almost 800 new emigrants. In a letter to Narcissa's parents, he expressed his belief that their most important purpose was to support white settlers moving into the region. He noted that the native people had not fulfilled the command to multiply and fill the earth, and felt they should not prevent others from doing so. This statement encapsulates how Whitman's priorities had shifted from ministering to the native Cayuse people to actively facilitating the American colonization of the region, even at the expense of the indigenous inhabitants. The Cayuse people watched with growing alarm and distress as ever-increasing numbers of American immigrants traveled through their ancestral lands. These settlers were depleting the scarce natural resources the Cayuse relied upon, using up firewood, overgrazing the lands used to feed their horses and cattle, and killing game without permission. In 1844, around 1,500 new immigrants arrived, and the following year that number had doubled. Many of these exhausted families would winter at the Whitman Mission before continuing on to the Willamette Valley in the spring. Accompanying this influx was the expansion of the mission complex, with more outbuildings constructed and additional fields fenced off. Narcissa Whitman observed that the influx of settlers had stirred up strong feelings among the native people. Tribal leaders persistently tried to persuade the Whitmans to leave, at times even turning to physical confrontations. Marcus Whitman was shoved, hit in the chest, cuffed, and had his ears pulled on separate occasions. When Whitman traveled east to protest the proposed closure of the Wailatpu mission, and later returned with even more settlers, the Cayuse leadership voiced their strong opposition. The Cayuses' understanding with Whitman was that his purpose was to teach them about Christianity. But instead, he had brought more people, developed more land, and brought sickness that killed many Cayuse. The Cayuse could see their traditional way of life being steadily eroded by the ever-growing influx of white settlers, fueling their growing resentment towards the Whitmans and the American immigrants they were facilitating. In 1847, over 4,000 new settlers arrived in Oregon country, further straining the region's resources and exacerbating tensions with the local indigenous populations. This mass influx of emigrants coincided with a devastating outbreak of measles among the Cayuse people, who had no natural immunity to the infectious diseases brought by the Euro-American colonists. The exact source of the measles epidemic is unclear. It may have originated from one of the emigrant wagon trains, or possibly from a recent Cayuse Walla Walla cattle trading party returning from California. Regardless, the effects on the local tribes were catastrophic. By some estimates, nearly half of the Native Americans living near the Whitman mission died from the outbreak. In contrast, while more than a dozen white people at the mission also fell ill with measles, only one, a 6-year-old child from an immigrant family, succumbed to the disease. Observing that Whitman's white patients tended to recover while his Indian patients did not, some Cayuse people began to suspect the doctor of deliberately killing their people in order to seize their land. The stark disparity in outcomes between the natives and the settlers further fueled the growing resentment and distrust the Cayuse felt towards the Whitmans and the constant influx of American immigrants they were facilitating into the region. This volatile situation was nearing a boiling point, setting the stage for a tragic and pivotal event in the history of the American West. The beliefs and traditions of the Cayuse people held that a healer or shaman whose patients died could be considered guilty of misusing their spiritual powers and could potentially face execution themselves as punishment. As a physician who had been presented to the Cayuse as a formidable sorcerer, Dr. Whitman was well aware of this susceptibility. Just months after arriving at the Wailatpu mission, Whitman had been called to treat the wife of a Cayuse head chief, who warned him that he would be killed if the woman died. Fortunately, that patient survived. However, Whitman was not so fortunate with other cases. In a letter to the American Board in 1845, he mentioned that he had recently been blamed for the deaths of 2 individuals, a young man who passed away from apoplexy and a tribal chief. Whitman recounted how the chief's son had come to him as the man was dying, angrily telling the doctor that he had killed his father, and that it would not be difficult for Whitman to be killed as well. The Cayuse belief that Whitman's medical treatments were responsible for the deaths of their people, combined with the resentment over the ever-increasing American settlement of their lands, created a deeply volatile situation that was rapidly hurtling towards a tragic confrontation. The Whitman mission was a flurry of action on the morning of November 29, 1847. Over 60 people were present, including several newly arrived immigrant families, a school teacher, a tailor who had been hired to make a new Sunday suit for Dr. Whitman, a group of laborers, and 10 children who had been taken in by the Whitmans over the years. Some of them orphans whose parents had tragically died on the Oregon Trail. 2 other families were living in a cabin at the mission sawmill, roughly 20 miles away in the Blue Mountains. Despite the chilly and foggy weather on that November day, the normal routines were underway. After the noon meal, some of the men began butchering a steer. Several of the children went to the schoolroom on the 2nd floor of the main mission house with their teacher. Downstairs, Narcissa Whitman was giving two of the Sager girls a bath, while her husband Marcus sat in the living room, absorbed in his reading. It was an ordinary day at the Whitman mission, unaware of the horrific events that were about to unfold and forever alter the course of the American West. By the time the sun had set that fateful day, the Whitman Massacre had claimed the lives of 9 people, including both Dr. and Mrs. Whitman. The only female victim of the incident, Narcissa, had been shot. 2 men managed to escape the violence, one of them, a carpenter named Peter D. Hall, reaching Fort Walla Walla the next morning to report the attack. However, Hall is believed to have drowned while trying to travel further by boat. An emigrant family of 5 had hidden under the floorboards of the mission house, and they too eventually made it to the safety of Fort Walla Walla. Tragically, 2 more men were killed the day after the initial assault. One of them, a 24-year-old worker, shot as he approached the mission with a load of lumber. He was buried on the spot by a French-Canadian named Joseph Stanfield, one of the Whitman's hired hands, who then began preparing the other victims for burial. It was on the morning of December 1st that Father J.B.A. Brouillet, a Catholic priest who had recently established a mission down the river, arrived at the grisly scene. In a letter, Brouillet described what he witnessed. 10 dead bodies, some punctured with balls and others roughly gashed by the hatchet, are scattered here and there, covered in blood and displaying the scars of the most heinous cruelty. Dr. Whitman's face was gashed 3 times. The skulls of 3 other people were smashed, causing their brains to leak out. The Whitman Massacre had reached its horrific conclusion, leaving a devastating toll and setting the stage for a brutal conflict between the Cayuse and the encroaching American settlers. The surviving witnesses at the Whitman mission were left to watch in horror as Father Brouillet and Joseph Stanfield gathered the dead bodies and loaded them into a wagon, as one of the Sager girls later recalled, all piled up like dead animals. The grim remains were then buried in a shallow trench. Tragically, the devastation did not end there. 2 more of the Whitman's wards, 6-year-old Louise Sager and 10-year-old Helen Mar Meek, the mixed-race daughter of mountain man Joe Meek, succumbed to measles just a few days after the massacre. And in a final brutal act of violence at the mission, 2 young emigrant men in their 20s, who were also ill with measles, were dragged from their beds and bludgeoned to death. This senseless killing marked the end of the Whitman Massacre's horrific toll. The survivors were left to grieve over the immense loss of life and grapple with the aftermath of this tragic event. In the aftermath of the Whitman Massacre, the surviving victims, mostly women and children, were held hostage for nearly a month before being ransomed by Peter Skeen Ogden, an official from the Hudson's Bay Company's Fort Vancouver. Shortly after Ogden and his men had escorted the former captives to the safety of Fort Vancouver, the Cayuse learned that settlers in the Willamette Valley had destroyed several of their villages and property along the upper Deschutes River. This reprisal infuriated the Cayuse, who went back to the Whitman mission and burned the buildings to the ground, after piling wagons and other belongings inside. The reaction of the white settlers to the horrors of the Whitman Massacre was one of outrage and a thirst for vengeance. The Oregon Spectator, a newspaper in Oregon City, urged that the barbarous killers be chased down with unyielding fury until their very blood paid for their infamous crimes. They should be hunted like beasts of the wild. Newly elected provisional governor George Abernethy echoed these sentiments, demanding immediate and prompt action to punish the perpetrators. In response, a volunteer militia of around 500 men, led by Colonel Cornelius Gilliam, set out in January 1848 to do just that, launching a campaign to exact retribution against the Cayuse tribe for the tragic events at the Whitman mission. In the aftermath of the Whitman Massacre, Joe Meek, a former mountain man who had settled near Oregon City and joined the provisional legislature, was tasked with taking news of the attack all the way to Washington, D.C. Arriving in the nation's capital in May 1848, Meek carried with him petitions from the settlers demanding federal protection. The timing of Meek's arrival proved fortuitous, as Congress had been debating for over 2 years whether to establish Oregon Territory as a federal entity, with a key point of contention being whether slavery would be permitted in the new territory. Ultimately, it was not. With Meek's urgent pleas and the petitions from the Oregon settlers, Congress finally acted, and President James K. Polk signed the bill establishing Oregon Territory in 1848, August 1848. Polk then appointed the first slate of territorial officers, including Joseph Lane, a veteran of the Mexican-American War from Indiana, as the new territorial governor. Meek himself was named as the U.S. Marshal for the territory. Lane arrived in Oregon City come March 1849 to find that the Cayuse, along with the Walla Walla and Nez Perce tribes, had endured over a year of harassment from volunteer militiamen. Resolute in his quest to resolve the conflict, Lane arranged a gathering with the tribal leaders at the Dalles in April. He offered them peace if those responsible for the killings at Wailatpu were handed over. If they refused, he warned of a war that would bring about their complete destruction, as distinguishing between the innocent and the guilty wouldn't be possible. Despite the threat, the Cayuse held out for another year. Eventually, a respected elder known as Young Chief arranged for the surrender of 5 men to face charges related to the attack. Among the accused was Tilukekt, the good-natured Cayuse, who had named the Whitman's little girl Cayuse Tami. The 5 prisoners were brought to Oregon City, where they faced trial, were found guilty of murder, and sentenced to hang. On June 3, 1850, Marshal Joe Meek executed the sentence.